topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leis.
Well, a warm welcome to everyone as we start our live broadcast on some very important issues that matter to Canadians. So we're so glad that everyone could join us today on September the 26th, 2024. So I want to begin by saying thank you everyone for your kind comments and participation. It's really very interesting, our discussions that we have with our special guests as we talk about, as I said, important issues. And so again, we welcome your feedback. It's amazing where people come in from. So at some point, I'm very tempted to ask you which provinces you're from and where you come from. I know we've got people from Manitoba to BC to Alberta to, right across the country. It's amazing how we really appreciate, we have just so much feedback. So I do want to start off by reflecting a little bit on the news. This week, we've got a lot of things happening. That's the understatement of the day. But I wanted to start off with a question. What do you think about paper straws? Now, you may recall that as a matter of public policy, the federal government introduced a legislation to ban plastic straws. And I wanted to highlight a very interesting Belgian study. It said that paper straws may be harmful for the environment. Did you hear about that? Canada has legislated the mandatory adoption of paper straws just in time as evidence comes in from Belgium that suggests otherwise. A study just published in the journal Food Additives and Contaminants examined more than 20 different brands of plant-based straws and found high levels of toxic chemicals in almost all of them. Quote, these eco-friendly plant-based straws are not necessarily a more sustainable alternative to plastic straws, concluded a research team based at Belgium's University of Antwerp. Go figure. So what do you think about those paper straws? I know in my own experience, they don't tend to work well. After a while, they kind of cease to function, and it's kind of awkward as you can't do what you got to do. So anyways, what do you think about those paper straws? The other thing that is very interesting, as we heard yesterday, more disturbing information about kind of the brokenness of our immigration system. You may know that we have well over 1.4 million immigrants coming in every year. It's like the gate has been open the last several years. And of course, we're a country based on immigration, but how is that portfolio managed? Well, in this particular case, we found out that since January of 2024, 12,915, that's 12,915 students that were let in as students have claimed asylum, refugee status in this country. So again, 12,915. What does that say about our immigration system? Like, you come in as a student, which is terrific, and study here, but then turn around and declare asylum. Is that really what the system was meant to do? So what do you think about that one? But I think that's, another story that will continue to unfold. We also found out this week that the next phases of carbon taxes will continue according to the intentions of the federal government. And so the next round of increases will be on April 1, Fool's Day, 2025. So April 1, 2025, the next phase of carbon tax increases will continue. And so that's costing Canadians an awful lot of money. It depends which province you're in, but it ends up being quite a bit. And according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, it can even cost you, this next round will cost you up to almost $3,000. So depending again on where you live. We also heard that yesterday there was a non-confidence vote that was tabled, and the motion to bring down the government in the federal House of Commons was defeated, and the vote was 211 to 120. So the world continues to unfold around us, and that's the context that we're in today. Now, so today we've got a lot of wood to chop. That's definitely the case today. We've got a lot of agenda, and we'll be talking about the rule of law. And is the rule of law being exercised? Is there justice in fact, or are we tilting towards tyranny? So we want to look at this issue thoughtfully and reflect on it. They are complex issues, but we want to talk about, well, the invocation or use of the Emergency Measures Act that was deemed illegal. We want to reference that. We want to talk about the Coutts blockade, and there were some sentences down that were handed down to a number of those parties that were charged with different offenses related to the Coutts border blockade. And those sentences just were announced a few weeks ago. We've got also the ongoing, in fact, the longest criminal trial in Canadian history in Ottawa with Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, leaders of the Truckers Convoy that made a huge impact not only in this country but around the world. And we also are wanting to talk about related actions and how do we make sense of this? What's going on as we try to understand what is the people in power, what is their narrative, what is the messaging they're wanting us to look at versus what is the facts or reality. So it requires a lot of discernment, and we've got to think about this. And we want to think about you in terms of citizen action. And what are your thoughts? So we welcome your feedback. We encourage you to like the conversation, obviously share it. If you think these issues are important, then please share them. Please like them. It really makes a difference in terms of how these things are picked up. And I obviously think they're important because they have to do with the rule of law. So I want to just highlight that briefly. What do we mean by the rule of law? And why does this matter? So just to put this into perspective, and I think you are familiar with certainly some of my thoughts over the years in the sense that the rule of law is foundational to our society. And there are various hallmarks of the rule of law that have really been developed over a long time, frankly, over some 800 years as we think of the Magna Carta and even before that. But the Magna Carta was certainly one of the seminal points in our history where there were certain hallmarks that defined the rule of law. For instance, was the law that was being passed or promulgated, is it feasible? Is it practically easy to follow that law? There was also the issue of fair enforcement. Is the rule of law or is the law being consistently applied from party to party? And there is not a double standard. Is the law stable? That is to say, it can't be arbitrary. It can't just simply change at the drop of a hat. There can be no arbitrary arrest, and you are presumed to be innocent in our legal tradition. You're not assumed to be guilty and locked up for indefinite periods of time. And on that note, you are deserving of a speedy trial. You have due process. And there is freedom of speech regarding the trial so that there can be a community, a public that is informed about the process, that it is in fact transparent. There is also no threats or intimidation regarding the exercise of that process. And the courts, of course, are critical to the exercise of the rule of law, as well as the police. The police, the enforcement branch of the law, is also critical. And so are we as citizens, as we uphold the marks, the hallmarks of the rule of law. And these things, I believe, are foundational as we look to the ability to exercise a free and democratic society where the individual has rights and freedoms and they are not superseded by the majority, that in fact the minority also uphold their rights and the ability to, in free conscience, speak their truth in a respectful way, and therein lies the rub. So how do we maintain a rule of law, but also the ability that people can speak up and dare to disagree so that we can, on this journey together as citizens, search for the truth? So that is, I know, a mouthful, but it's important to lay out the basic background in our classical liberal tradition as a free and democratic society, what are the hallmarks of the rule of law? So that's why I think today's discussion really does matter, because it relates to not only our sense of justice and fair play, as all Canadians we value that, but also our prosperity. If you don't have a stable rule of law, if you don't have property rights and freedom, who in their right mind would invest in our land and be able to develop our economy and our quality of life? So I'm excited about this conversation, and we have a lot of wood to chop. And so I am very excited to welcome a friend, a guest, an author, and a senior fellow at Frontier, and his name is Ray McGinnis. So a warm welcome to you, Ray.
Hey, David, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. And Ray, it's great to see you. I know you've been doing some traveling, and you are an incredible researcher, and I really admire your insights in terms of the kind of topics we just outlined. And Ray, you have, and it is really quite exciting to talk about a book that you're going to be releasing very shortly with the Frontier Center and also the publisher Sutherland Books. It's called Unjustified. I love the book. I've had the privilege and opportunity to read it, of course, but it's not. We're getting close to the release point here. So, why did you write this book, Unjustified, and can you tell us what it's about?
Well, sure. I mean, here's the book. I mean, right
There it is.
there, Unjustified, the Freedom Convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the inquiry that got it wrong. It actually was released on the 17th of September, so you can order it online sellers like Amazon or Barnes and Noble if you're in the States, or your favorite local bookstore in Canada. Yeah, it's available for the public to have a conversation about what we think happened in 2022 and then going forward regarding all of the Freedom Convoy, the protests around the mandates, pandemic measures, and the government's response to all of that. And so, yeah, it felt like a calling to write a book like this in the face of the media landscape that was really pitching the talking points from the government in Ottawa with an imbalanced, cherry picking way of reporting, which goes against the solid traditions of what I mean. I years back in the day, I was once somebody who would even give money to the Friends of the CBC to keep making sure that the CBC was there, doing the great reporting that I got to know them doing back when Barbara Frum and others back in the last century. But it suddenly got hijacked or forgot all the journalistic standards that it knew to stand by, and so into the breach, into the the gap of what was going on. There I entered, and it's actually, I mean, for me, as I'm an author of a number of books, taught writing workshops for several decades. I'm not somebody who's got an address book full of people who are part of the working class. I just know one person I'm acquainted with who's down in Portland, Oregon, who's a truck driver. But otherwise, truck drivers are just people who drive down, the streets that I pass, and I don't, So for me to be writing a book, like it was because of the growing disconnect between what I was hearing from other people about what was being reported, and then as I began to see, through people like Rupa Subramanya, who's a person of color, a woman who was reporting every day for 3 weeks in Ottawa about how she never encountered any misogynistic or racist moment in all of her reporting and interviews with over 150 or more protesters in Ottawa, plus much more. I began to see that there was something amiss with the story we were being told, the official story of record by the media and our government ministers.
Well, you certainly tell it well. And again, I vouch for the book. I love it. So that's the book Unjustified. So you can buy it right now on Amazon. Is that correct, Ray?
Yes, you can buy it right now on Amazon. You can buy it at McNally Robinson in Winnipeg or Saskatoon, or other bookstores that you wherever you happen to live that you want to support.
Okay, so with your help, Ray, we're going to go through a lot of background here, but I again recommend that book as a way that really it's a stunning book because it contrasts so well the contrast between what we were told again and again. It was like a steady drumbeat of messages, beginning even with the Prime Minister really demonizing the truckers' convoy even before they arrived in Canada, or sorry, in Ottawa. Um, and then to see what really happened on the ground, as you said, was very peaceful. And, it's just really quite an example. So, as you read, what is your hope that when people read the book, that they'll come away with a thought of what? What are you hoping that the reader will conclude?
I'm hoping that the reader will conclude that it's possible that governments from time to time will be upset with people that question their policies. And as a result of that, they will opt for going for the jugular and demonizing and scapegoating those who dare question the policies to such an extent that it'll end up with lawfare and the longest mischief trial in history and other things, which then becomes a warning to all Canadian citizens that we will, as our Prime Minister said at the Public Order Emergency Commission, that when people are protesting regarding public policies, it's worrisome. And we need to get back to living in a country where our Prime Minister and our government ministers do not think it's worrisome for Canadian citizens to question public policy in a protest, if especially they found that any other avenue, contacting their MPs, phoning petitions and so on, is fruitless and not resulting in any kind of engaged discussion about the wisdom of, in this case, the vaccine mandates or the lockdowns or a host of other things. So I think we need to realize that it's dangerous when governments scapegoat people, and it can go to some pretty dark places.
I think you're absolutely right. I actually think of, as you know, I've looked in terms of the history of so many regimes, including totalitarian ones, and I think that's so true. The lessons of history are very clear. You cannot take our freedom for granted when a government doesn't really respect the fact that there's a diversity of intellectual views or perspectives on public policy. Then that does go to dark places, as you say. So again, the book, please take a look at it, Unjustified, and so with your help, let's do some updating on a couple of these case studies because it's very interesting, and they all have their own complexity, and we'll be kind of touching the surface of them. So it's a pretty humbling exercise. So let's go back in our time machines, Ray, with your kind help. You let's reflect on first of all the truckers convoy. And essentially, how did we get to the point where we have Chris Barber and Tamara Leach on trial? And it's the longest criminal trial, to my knowledge, in this country. Is that true? Like, what brought us to this point?
Well, it's certainly certainly the longest mischief trial in the history of the country. I'm not sure if it's the longest criminal trial ever, but mischief trial for sure. Mischief trials normally go like half a day, like 3 hours, and then it's done. This one has gone 45 days with all kinds of gaps between defense and Crown submitting additional material, and the verdict will come out probably January, February of 2025. And I want to mention too that these are among the charges, in Ottawa, there was all kinds of rhetoric around violence But nobody in the protests in Ottawa was ever arrested for socking someone in the jaw or kicking someone in the knee or smashing a window of a business. What the government has in the Ottawa protests finally are two people who are being grilled for mischief charges. And the protests, of course, began because the government here federally decided that it was necessary, in their view, that anyone who was a truck driver, Canadian truck drivers, but entering back into Canada, would be required to be vaccinated. If they weren't vaccinated, then they'd have to go into quarantine. I'm not remembering whether it's 10 or 14 days, but in either case, if you come back in your truck and you have to go in quarantine for 10 days, 3 times a month, you're going to have 3 days a month to do some work. Otherwise, you'll be in quarantine. So that raises the question about the right to livelihood in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And at that point, you have around the world, the Center for Disease Control Director Rochelle Walensky was saying back in August on CNN to Wolf Blitzer of 2021 that the vaccine didn't prevent infection, it didn't stop transmission. So for the unvaccinated truck drivers, they're saying, well, why should I be required to have a vaccine that doesn't prevent infection or stop transmission? There were other people who were asking in the trucking industry and numbers of different premiers saying, why wouldn't just getting a PCR test at the border be good enough? So as a result of the government's insistence, that was the trigger for the protest. Initially, too, I want to say there were reports by the CBC when trucks were heading east and arriving in Kamloops, Salmon Arm, British Columbia, in the central interior, that the protesters were, well behaved, peaceful, and so on. But that suddenly began to change quite quickly, and then it was the CBC reporting that had it not been for Russian actors whispering in the ears of truck drivers, no one would have gotten off their duff and headed to Ottawa in the first place, and other allegations. So it ended up being very quickly everything but the kitchen sink. The truck drivers protesters were setting residential apartment buildings on fire, and on and on and on. That they were, Diane Deans, who's one of the people in the City Council of Ottawa at the time, that there were mercenaries and insurrectionists, or that they were all Donald Trump supporters that were giving money to the crowdfunding, and one after another in the Public Order Emergency Commission, these kinds of allegations are put to rest. The testimony of police like Patrick Morse, who's like key intelligence officer with the Ontario Provincial Police, described what was going on as peaceful, family friendly events that were happening, corroborated by CSIS assessments, by Ottawa police statements to the POEC, and yet what happens in the whole report is that Justice Rouleau waves away the testimony of the intelligence and police officers describing how the protest was not a concern, and then points to several Ottawa residents who talked about, they're upset with hearing the honking of horns, which by the 7th of February had, for all intents and purposes, stopped, given a provincial justice's order, Justice McLean's order, to stop honking the horns, which they did do. But the residents said, that they still heard the phantom honking, like they were, traumatized by it. And Justice Rouleau reworks the definition of the word violence to include then psychological violence, which then becomes a justification in his mind for invoking the Emergencies Act. Now, if we applied that in general, every time somebody feels psychologically upset by somebody else's action in this country, we could have a constant Emergencies Act declaration all the time, because there are all manners of things that people can get agitated about and upset about and psychologically bothered by. So the catastrophizing and alarmism by government minister after government minister and by senior bureaucrat after senior bureaucrat, Jody Thomas, the national national security advisor of the prime minister at the time, talking about when she was asked under the stand, of an inquiry, well, what was the violence? Well, she said, well, there was pollution. There were diesel engines running. I mean, we have countless First Nations reserves in this country that have had for decades no clean drinking water. I mean, that's pollution. That's a serious problem. Not diesel trucks running, inconvenient as it is. And also there's the lack of proportionate, there was at no point did the Ottawa police force or the Ontario or the Ottawa provincial or municipal determine that the protest constituted a riot. So at no point did they say, we're going to give you folks 1 hour's warning and then we're going to declare this a riot and we're going to clean things up. That never happened. They didn't ticket people's vehicles because the police, decided to wave each truck, each vehicle onto different streets on Wellington and Kent and other streets, and said, waving away, okay, you with, Chris Barber, you put your truck here. And the protesters followed the direction of the police officers to park their vehicles where they were parked. And then when things got really dicey with the rhetoric of the government, federally, municipal leaders, and so on, key people involved in the volunteers with the convoy met with the Ottawa police, Ottawa city council officials, and an agreement was signed with the mayor, Jim Watson, and Tamara Litch. And we said, we're going to move 75% of all the vehicles out of the city by the end of the 16th of February. And by noon on the 14th of February, city officials were taking photographs of the license plates of 104 or so trucks that had already left the city by noon that day. And then, well, that all stopped because by 4:30 that afternoon, the prime minister invoked the Emergencies Act. So, there was a tangible demonstration of goodwill on the part of the protesters to try and de-escalate things, but that was short-lived given the government's determination, it seems, to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Mm-hmm. So it's quite a stunning array of details, and details do matter here. The facts matter. And so in the book, you do a brilliant job documenting literally hundreds of details that minute by minute show the kind of story that was being told. Like there's so many of them that were in effect started up about the convoy that were confirmed as not accurate at all. Like, for example, there was a terrible story that somehow they were stealing food from a food bank, as an example. So it's very interesting, this whole question then regarding narrative. And then the larger issues that we also determine that you've alluded to is that in the case of, well, the vaccine itself, the mandate was not being effective. Like it did, the vaccine did not prevent the transmission of the COVID-19. And so one of the questions I have, Ray, for you is, if you think of the protesters, do you think many of them were actually vaccinated? Do we actually even know any answer to that question?
I understand sorry, I had to move because my Wi-Fi connection was a little dicey. Yes, I mean, Rupa Subramanya writes for the National Post, and she lives in downtown Ottawa. She spoke to, certainly there were some unvaccinated protesters, but there were many vaccinated protesters as well. Anna Farrow, who writes for a Catholic newspaper in Montreal was down there, and she also encountered the same thing. I mean, there were many people who were vaccinated who were protesting that did not agree with numbers of the mandates, whether it was the lockdown of schools or whatever the case. So it wasn't the case that all the protesters were quote unquote anti-vaxxers, or that they'd never gotten a vaccine in their life. You know, some had decided not to get this particular vaccine because of the 8-week trial. I mean, and waiting to find out what the information is after people have gotten it.
Exactly. Yeah, so it is really almost overwhelming, right? The amount of background and detail. I mean, you even had the planting of a Confederate flag and a Nazi flag, and all of a sudden they disappear, and it's almost absurd. Did we ever really figure out, Ray, who planted the Nazi flag? I know there's certainly been a lot of accusations.
I don't know. I think that, I mean, there's this one particular photo of these several men on the west side of the Chateau Laurier hotel on this one day, waving a Nazi flag. Not in a place where protesters generally would even see it. The photo that was taken of it was, I think, Justin Ling with he got it. There was somebody who was actually a photographer connected to, I think, Paul Martin, former prime minister, who was taking the photo. In any event, the photo was presented so frequently, it was as if there were thousands of Nazi flags on Parliament Hill. But I've heard from Rodney Palmer, who's a long time anchor for CBC, CTV, worked with Globe and Mail, Vancouver Sun, Toronto Star. Talked about how it's just so odd, and the whole circumstance of that flag. He was there for 6 days. He never saw a Nazi flag. I've talked to numbers of people who were there the whole time and never saw a Nazi flag. So the impression that was given to the general public about if you keep posting a Nazi flag all the time, people will start thinking that there are dozens of Nazi flags. But what people were seeing who were there on the ground was Canadian flags. So again, it's a construction that's meant to create a certain impression, and I think it's I don't know that we've ever had a moment in Canadian history where we've had such a misrepresentation or deception in our news coverage, because I mean I've read in the past about other countries, and I would think I'm really glad that we're not there. I mean, if you were following the Tiananmen Square episode in China back in, was it 1990, 89, 90, if you were following Voice of America or some outlets out of Hong Kong, you would learn that the protesters were peaceful students in Beijing. However, if you were following the story through the newspapers, radio, and state-run media on newscasts in China, you would believe that the suggestion that the protesters were students was nothing but imperialist propaganda, and all of the protesters were criminals, ruffians, and anarchists that hated China. So as a consequence of that being drummed into the Chinese citizenry, if you went to China today, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who would agree with you that the protesters in Tiananmen Square to this day were in fact students, which they were. So I think that the harm done by having the repetition of a lie that the protesters were violent, that they wanted to overthrow the government, that they were all white supremacists. When the cameras could have gone to the indigenous drummers that were drumming every day, to the Muslim Canadians who were leading prayers on their mats every Friday, and Sikh truck drivers and Asian Canadians aplenty. So there, it was not at all what it was being depicted as, but it served the interests of those who wanted to demonize and discredit those asking, where's the beef regarding, how safe the vaccine is. I mean, today we have, well, I think I last checked in early January this year, according to Health Canada officially, 488 people died as a consequence of getting this vaccine. That's their own low ball estimate, even though, of course, nobody who got vaccinated within the first 14 days is counted as vaccinated. So they're not part of the equation in this calculation by Health Canada. But there's reasons for people to have been concerned, but yet it's all waved away.
So, but this is the point, is that virtually everything that was asserted by authorities federally, in retrospect, has been proven to be incorrect. I can't, I don't want to sound histrionic here, but I can't think of one that wasn't. Can you, Ray?
Well, we have, thankfully, the federal court's judgment by the judicial review by Justice Richard Mosley that concluded that the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act was unconstitutional. And now that's going to be able to give numbers of people, hundreds and hundreds of people who had their bank accounts frozen, a civil route to a legal remedy for the government's overreach.
Yeah. So to be clear here, then ultimately you have the Justice Mosley come in, I believe it was last year in January, weighs in and says, yes, this was it was not necessary, the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act, and nor was it justified. And it was a violation of charter rights and freedoms. And if you read the decision, as I have, it's a brilliant decision because it summarizes up all these issues. So I encourage people to read those original documents, and I think you'll be stunned at his incisive analysis. So the bottom line then is that when you shake out all the history of the convoy, obviously there was an aggressive effort to push a narrative that these people were basically domestic terrorists, that they were un-Canadian, they had unacceptable views, to quote the Prime Minister. In this context, though, we have a trial now with Chris Barber and Tamara Leach. And what are the charges, Ray? And what's the status of that trial?
Well, there's the charge of counseling mischief, common between the two of them. And I'm forgetting what the other additional one is for Chris Barber. But in any event, they like the trial. The Crown prosecution would bring videotape of different moments in the 3 weeks of the protest, and it was often is it the word exculpatory? It was often showing that that the two accused were behaving legally and responsibly and peacefully, and counseling peaceful behavior. So at times it was a real head scratcher. I sat in on several days of the trial because I happened to be in Ottawa, coinciding by coincidence the part of the trial back in November of 2023. And I'd sit through, and of course, the air in there is pretty. You want to have almost like an oxygen bag to keep awake and alert. But in any event, the Crown case seemed really weak, and conflating the suggestion that Chris Barber and Tamara Leach had control over every single other person who was there, up to 18,000 people on a given day on a weekend. But also, where is the evidence of violence? There were no arrests for physical violence. There were no arrests for physical damage of property. and so on. So it seems that we've gotten to kind of the Chicken Little moment in Canadian history where we have a choice as citizens. If someone starts running around saying the sky is falling, will we let them keep doing that and get us all agitated and worked up? Or will we step back and say, maybe it's not falling. Maybe it would have been a simple thing to have some deputy minister or someone else go and speak, arrange to speak to a few of the key people who were part of the convoy, and maybe they could have had a conversation. Maybe they wouldn't have agreed. I don't know what kind of concessions there would have been, but it could have ended much differently, and certainly not with any need for an invocation of an Emergencies Act for a fake emergency.
Okay, so that, in your opinion, is kind of the bottom line, is that this is they had to really ramp up the rhetoric, demonize these parties, so that in fact they could ultimately invoke the Emergencies Measures Act for really political purposes. Is that kind of your thesis, that you the takeaway here, Ray?
Yeah, the Emergencies Act was not necessary, and the catastrophizing and the inflating of what constitutes a national emergency.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so quickly, we've got some questions here. Peter Mueller asks, so are you saying we should be able to arrest and charge the Prime Minister for what he did, and we should be able to charge the NDP for obstruction of justice? Well, I don't pretend to be a lawyer, but it's a very interesting question. If I'm getting Peter's question, is where's the accountability here? The government weighs in with all these measures, even demonetize people that donated to the convoy. There's a lot of implications. This was illegal. The use of the Emergency Measures Act. So what do you say to that question?
Okay, so given the judicial review and the court ruling by Justice Richard Mosley that the government acted unconstitutionally, there now is the Prime Minister and other numbers of ministers and other senior government officials. Prime Minister Trudeau, Deputy Minister Freeland, National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister Jody Thomas, and others are named in a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit by dozens of people who were personally affected by the freezing of bank accounts. And so that civil litigation is the most tangible result of what Justice Mosley's decision allows for. I'm not sure governments and government leaders can do all manner of things that may be judged in history to be illegal, but what they can be held accountable for is another matter.
It's a very good question, though. Where's the accountability? So there may be some class actions, but also ultimately we end up at the ballot box as we look to another change of government. But I think the point is very apropos. We can't forget about this history. I think you've got a whole series of parties that do not want to remember this history. They want it to go away because in retrospect, it makes them look incompetent and certainly at worst malevolent in terms of their efforts to vilify citizens who led peaceful protests. That's a seminal part of our free and democratic society. And so ultimately it's going to be the measures that we can hold these different parties in account. So I need to move on here. I noticed the time here because that Ottawa trial is moving along. We'll see what the decision is like and how it all shakes out. But Tamara Leach and Chris Barber have been really put through the ringer by a government that seems intent on persecuting them unfairly for their leadership involvement in this convoy. So speaking of other aspects of this, we know that one of the key rationales for the invocation of the Emergencies Measures Act was that it had to be a crisis that was national in nature. And so one of the key things was what happened in Coutts. Can you explain quickly what happened with the border blockade there, Ray, and about the so-called Coutts 4 and where we're at today?
So during, coinciding the protests in Ottawa, there were other protests in Emerson, Manitoba, Windsor, Sarnia, Surrey, British Columbia, and so on, and Coutts, Alberta, across from Sweetgrass, Montana. And I think about eight days of the protests, there were, it was always a free flow of traffic back and forth across the border. So they didn't close the border throughout the whole time. But in any event, there was a protest there. And on the evening of the 13th of February, two men were arrested, Chris Leis and Tony Oleanic. They were unarmed. They had no criminal record. Then Chris Carbert was arrested in the wee small hours of the morning of the 14th of February. He was sleeping in a trailer. He came out, he was unarmed. And then there was Jerry Morin, who had left the protest and was there only really briefly for a number of days. And he was, at the time he was arrested in the noon hour on the 14th, he was driving west of Calgary on way to Pritis to do an electrical job for a rancher. And all four of them were arrested initially under kind of mischief charges, and then they ended up having conspiracy to commit murder of police officers. And that serious charge put them all in, at the Crown's insistence, put them all in remand centers for 2 years for all four of them. Two of them, Jerry Morin and Chris Lysek, were released on the 6th of February as a result of plea deals. Chris Lysek had a handgun, and it was like he should have had it secured behind a locked cabinet or something like that. Anyway, he didn't, so he pled to that, which normally would be a minor fine, not 2 years in jail. And then Jerry Morin pled to conspiracy to traffic firearms. Not that he ever took any firearms down to Coutts at all, but a conspiracy to do so. Now, interestingly, during the Coutts 2 trial for Tony Oleanic and Chris Carbert, the Crown wanted to introduce as evidence the plea deal of Jerry Morin pleading to conspiracy to traffic firearms. And the judge didn't allow it because very often when someone's been in jail for 2 years, they will plead to something if it's their ticket out of jail, and so under duress. So it wasn't allowed even as evidence. So maybe under different circumstances, Jerry Morin would never have pled to that in the first place. So then we have Chris Carbert and Tony Oleanic maintaining their innocence, and the trial began in June, went on for 8 weeks, based on events, I think, that happened in the Coutts 3 trial in April with Marco van Hugenbos, Alex and George, I forget their last names, who were 3 men who were actually assisting the police, the RCMP, in de-escalating the protest and winding it down. They were still found guilty of mischief. So in light of this new kind of understanding of mischief, even if you're working with the police to cooperate and wind things down and help the protest end, you can still be charged with mischief. So Chris Carbert's lawyer said that he was going to plead guilty to mischief from the get-go. And that was what he pled, but not to possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose. At the end of the 8-week trial, the jury found Carbert and Oleanic guilty of mischief and possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose. They never brandished any weapons. They don't have any criminal history, but they were in the vicinity, about 6 blocks away or so. And I think that the message that the verdict sends to the general public is, if you are ever thinking of attending a public protest for any reason, you better make sure that if you happen to be a gun owner, that you better not have your guns anywhere near the vicinity of where the protest is happening. Now, I want to add an additional layer to how careful one will need to be, because Tony Olenek was also charged with possession of a dangerous explosive for dangerous purpose, and his explosive device that he had was still in his home, 2-hour drive away from Coutts, and that was something that his father had passed down to him as dad died in 2017, and where the permit for that explosive device, which would have been used based on testimony at the trial for dislodging drill, if you're drilling away in a rock quarry and you get some drill stuck, you need to have an explosive device to dislodge it from the stone wall. In any event, Tony Olenek had not updated or renewed the permit for the explosive device, so that got him in a lot of trouble. So if you ever have an explosive device, you better make sure your permit's up to date. I want to say also about the sentencing. The judge's tone throughout the trial seemed to be was very even. And he said in his words to the jury before they were sequestered to reach their verdict that, he reminded them that, you have to be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt. And that the judge said his mind about things had changed quite a bit since the trial had begun. And then after the jury came forward with their not guilty verdict on conspiracy to commit murder, the Crown appealed or made motion to appeal days later. And then after that, at the end of August, there was a week of preliminary hearings in advance of sentencing, and the judge's tone changed quite a lot. And on the 9th of September, when he laid down his sentence, he started talking about a trial that he'd been involved in part, where there was this terrible murder of 4 RCMP officers in Mayerthorpe, Alberta, back around 2005. And I think we can all agree that when someone actually does murder a police officer, it's a dreadful thing, and whoever does that should have the book thrown at them. And you have people who were accessory to that murder who got 7 years in jail. And now you have 2 men who were unarmed, who had no criminal record, who didn't, in fact, murder anyone, who have 6.5 years. So it seems, at least to many of the people who've been following the trial in Lethbridge closely or sat in there, that there's a disproportionate conclusion to what the sentence is. Many people thought that by the time the trial ended, that these 2 men would get out basically for time served, but that's not what's happened. So there is an appeal.
All right. So there is an appeal there. So I'm talking with Ray McGinnis, a author and researcher. He's a senior fellow at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. We've just released the book Unjustified. I recommend the book to you. It can be found on Amazon. And we're reflecting on a lot here in terms of the trials in Ottawa with Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, as well as the Coutts 4. They are called the so-called Coutts 4. Now, 2, as you mentioned, took a plea this past February in 2024, but the other charges are really quite horrendous in terms of the sentencing. The treatment of the Coutts 4 really strikes me as almost bizarre, as they were put in solitary and remand for, you said, almost 2 years. I mean, this seems really excessive. And And of course, we know that the whole conspiracy to murder a police officer was did not hold. Was that a fair treatment of them in your mind, Ray?
We have cases in recent years where people are accused of actually having murdered a police officer in Ontario, in Southern Ontario, who were facing, facing a trial, murdered the police officer, and they get to go out on bail, the next day after they're arrested. And then you have these four who didn't kill anybody, who didn't brandish any weapons, who end up in custody, all four of them, until February of this year, when two of them are released on minor plea deals. And we have a history where it's almost unheard of not to be given bail. You can have conditions about maybe an ankle monitor or whatever to make sure that, none of them were thought to be a flight risk. None of them had a history of violence. What it all boiled down to finally was that they were kept denied bail so that there would not be any a lack of there would not be any consequent lack of confidence on the part of the general public in the judicial system should these four be granted bail. But it really is a rather circular thing. It's like if you only keep people behind bars because you don't want people to lose confidence in the justice system. They're the ones that have charged them with this very serious accusation of conspiracy to commit murder, which ends up being not guilty. So we don't want to have a legal system where Crown prosecutors know if you accuse someone of the most serious crime you can think of, domestic terrorism, whatever you want to do, and then have Crown prosecutors confident, well, we know then that we don't ever have to give that person bail because we've got a charge of this really, really serious. There needs to be. There's some people who I've listened to who've talked about, as police officers, who said that, what happened with the evidence here? If the conspiracy to commit murder had been solid, in addition to all of that, the seriousness of the whole thing, why not bring the trial, bring the men to a speedy trial? Why wait for 2.5 years? And also you have the whole problem of disclosure. Even in the closing words to the jury by the Crown, they were introducing new allegations about what the men had done. And that doesn't seem to be the way evidence, is handled in a criminal court.
Well, look, again, there's a lot of layers of detail there around this trial that frankly raise many more questions around whether justice has been done, in my humble opinion. And I want to give you some examples. I think that you have, in my perspective, frankly, the staging of the crime, in the sense that you have a whole narrative that's being created here. You have, for example, the RCMP, and obviously we know that the RCMP is very important. But in this case, it raises disturbing questions regarding the conduct of a number of parties here, including the RCMP. On February 12, you had damage to excavators and private property when they don't appear to have had any authority to do so, all to stage the notion that somehow these protesters, these peaceful protesters, were damaging private property. This is what I understand. We also have the question around the role of taps or intercepts. Were they legal or not? We also have the whole question around the role of undercover RCMP officers. There is a lot of questions here. Even the staging of the media conference where they showed weaponry, these were not the guns of the parties charged, were they? or were they?
Well, I think that some of them were, but much of them had not to do with them. And but if you collect a whole bunch of weapons and ammunitions, it gives the appearance of something much more sinister and nefarious than is actually the case.
Yeah,
I mean,
but it's a photo op though, and it
photo op.
wasn't even sealed in terms of proper evidence. This is my understanding. Now, if somebody can correct us, please do so. But this is the incredible findings of a number of parties, and I look to people to ask: is this appropriate within a justice system, or is this really about Ray upholding a narrative that these are, quote, again, domestic terrorists that pose an imminent national threat, and here yet again we need to put them in remand almost indefinitely for some 2 years, and the evidence didn't seem to support that at all. Am I being too cynical here?
No, and when you have, I mean, normally when you have, especially female undercover officers, given the unpredictability of what might happen, especially if you are dealing with domestic terrorists, given the rhetoric of what they say they thought was going on, wouldn't you want to have the female undercover officers be wired so they could record their interactions so that others listening in could know if they're safe or not? But they didn't do that, and that's also problematic with the way that you end up.
Just hold on for a sec, Ray. You're saying that there were undercover officers, females no less,
Yeah,
that were not wired and recorded. Why would they do that?
yeah. I mean, in policing in the 2020s, there's no reason for them not to be wired. So it's a very odd thing, and then you have then you just end up with statements about what an RCMP officer says, and I mean, in our history, we have the War Measures Act. There ended up being something called the McDonnell Commission from 1977 to 1981, looking into what happened with the War Measures Act, and that's partly because there was an RCMP officer who was in a different trial in the mid 1970s, and there was something that he was being questioned about, and he said, well, that's not a problem because we did the same kind of thing during the War Measures Act. And so doing some illegal things. I mean, the RCMP back then, they burned down a barn and blamed it on the FLQ, or they infiltrated cell groups that were no longer peopled by anyone but other undercover officers, and then sent out some scary press releases to give the impression that the FLQ were still dangerous and a threat. So the McDonnell Commission, went into that. So we know that in our long history, from time to time, police officers will perjure themselves. Now, they may not be caught by that, but we need to have a system where these kind of things are ironclad. So you don't have the developments that have happened in this case should be very concerning to Canadians, because things can be inferred then. I mean, a lot of the allegations on the part of the Crown toward the two men who were on the stand, Carbot and Oleanic, were about the meaning of words. Well, if somebody says, going to a hardware store, well, that really doesn't mean that. It means weapons. I mean, if I'm saying to somebody as a police officer, well, I know when that person said they were going to get some groceries, it really meant they were going to get some grenades. I mean, in that kind of a world, then, going forward, police officers can say that someone said they were going to go and play a game of baseball, but that really meant they were going to go and get some weapons. If we can refashion any word we want to make it nefarious and dangerous, that puts all of us as citizens in a place of some vulnerability, because anyone could accuse us of anything, even if we really did say I was going to meet David Leis for dinner at a restaurant, really meant something else, So we need to watch that kind of wordsmithing doesn't become something that's weaponized to put people in jail.
Right on. So you're raising serious questions, and frankly, I think challenging every one of us to use our critical thinking skills to not be naive that justice can go wrong, that there can be untoward things happening. And in fact, I will tell you this, that it is fascinating that there has been the allegation of crime fraud. It took enormous courage, but a number of defense lawyers came out on this within the trial at Coutts and said that the police acted improperly in a number of cases. And I believe there's a sealed envelope now where I'm not clear what's in the envelope. It remains to be seen. But I think it will be very interesting to see if someday parties come forward and are able to, quote, open the seal of that case and pursue those issues. Because it seems like, again, this case has raised a lot of questions whether justice has actually been done or has it been denied. So when we look at these issues as well, I think it's fascinating, Ray, like you've raised the alarm bells that frankly these people have been persecuted by the justice system. They haven't been about serving justice. And I think the question I have is, how are these cases all connected? Were they really all about a government aggressively pursuing a narrative to justify their political decisions to invoke the Emergencies Measures Act? Like, you basically, if we look carefully at the history of these things, we know the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor was wound up well in advance of the invocation of the act. We know that Ottawa was just about totally wrapped up as well. And they were literally leaving Ottawa. And they had all the deals with the city, and police authorities said there was no emergency here. And then you had Coutts. So that was a very important part of stringing this together. But is it all part of upholding that narrative, Ray? Is that the bottom line?
Well, I think that there are political consequences for not upholding the narrative. If government ministers and the Prime Minister start to concede, well, we overreacted here. Actually, it wasn't a national emergency, or some other such statement to the press, then there'll be I think there would be a different kind of political price, because then whether it's Marco Mendocino or Bill Blair, or Prime Minister Trudeau or Chrystia Freeland could have their concessions to the press, those sound bites could then be part of political ads for the next election. So I think that there's a calculation that they will double down and triple down and never admit that there was anything but a national emergency. But I think that we need to be concerned as citizens if what happened. I mean, of course, Justice Mosley found that was unconstitutional. There was no emergency. But if we allow future prime ministers to believe that the threshold in 2022 on Valentine's Day was met, then we could well see more of these invocations of an emergency and more frequently. We hopefully can have a discussion, which is partly why I wrote the book. Hopefully we can have a discussion. We can revisit our assumptions about what happened. I mean, because certainly, for me, if there were, if there was if what happened in Ottawa was like Charlottesville, was in West Virginia in 2019, where there were lots of Nazis or whatever down in, at least the way the news reported that, then I could be concerned in a different kind of way. I mean, if there actually were all kinds of people being punched and kicked and all kinds of businesses being looted.
But the bottom line is there wasn't.
There wasn't.
And therefore, are you saying I'm trying to get a yes or no out of you, Ray.
Yeah.
So it's about narrative telling. Is that what it
Yeah.
is?
Yeah, it's about narrative telling. And when we have a narrative that's false, it does incredible damage to the story we tell about ourselves when we get that narrative wrong. And it means that we end up having to tell ourselves lies about what's happened, and that begins to affect our psyches, our souls, our mental, emotional landscape, because a part of us can't face the truth. Then, if we decide as a nation that we will believe a lie about insurrectionists and mercenaries on the steps of Parliament in February of 2022, we need to be able to cleanse ourselves of that misimpression, of that falsehood, and to come to grips with what actually was which was going on, which was a strong disagreement around public policy. Back in 1935, R.B. Bennett met with 8 protesters from the March on Ottawa from Regina, and I don't know that they settled very much, but they did meet in person, and they, having a face-to-face meeting and airing disagreements, across the table from one another has been the Canadian way. Trying to find a middle ground. You can't find a middle ground, fine, but at least you have to try. And that means you don't decide that the people who are trying to seek a dialogue with you are a fringe minority with unacceptable views. That's not a way forward.
Well said, Ray. I like what you're saying. I'm speaking with Ray McGinnis. He's the author of a recent book, Unjustified. I encourage you to buy it. It's on Amazon. And Ray is a senior fellow at Frontier, as well as a researcher and author. And Ray, I think your point is well said. The truth matters, certainly in a free and democratic society. And those points of history are well said, where, I mean, I certainly, as a former elected official, you meet all the time with people that disagree with you. That's an important part of healthy democracy in our tradition in Canada, and that's important. And yet, these government officials did the opposite. They demonized them. And I think that's where you get into very uncomfortable questions around what's really going on here. Is it just about kind of political power and tactics to try to separate and say either you're with our agenda or you're not? And those people that dare to disagree with your agenda will be vilified. And what I find so unnerving about this conversation, Ray, then, is that these are the playbooks used by totalitarian regimes. I think of Mao in China, was a master at vilifying parties, separating them out, and basically saying these people are enemies of the people. And so that's kind of the narrative that's slanting here. And I know that sounds very dramatic, but aren't these things that we need to really pay attention to, Ray?
We do need to pay attention. We need to watch as citizens for propaganda. We need to be able to consider that propaganda is not just something that happens in long ago places like Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy or in North Korea or China. That we can end up with state media and the CBC, which seems to have been encouraged to not report anything about the downside to what was happening for people across the country once they got vaccinated, all in the effort to assure people and not make them vaccine hesitant if there should ever be a single story about someone who's not had a good reaction, for example. And if you have this slanted kind of reporting and slanted narrative by the government, it distorts our ability to have a public conversation that's healthy, especially if we're being told that anyone who disagrees with the prime minister or the government in power will be canceled. And we have lots of examples outside of the Emergencies Act. We have Jordan Peterson right now, who's doing his who's going to be doing his retraining or whatever it is with the college in Ontario. So there's lots of messages to the general public that if you don't bow to the person in charge and what their what their edicts and regulations advise, there will be severe consequences for you, and that's not a healthy environment in which democracy can flourish.
Absolutely. You know, there's a very famous quote from Mao who said, "Not to have a correct political orientation is like not having a soul." So today, in today's context, I think what that means is if you don't have the correct orientation towards, well, the narratives of various governments around diversity, equity, inclusion, COVID-19, what are some other narratives? I mean, the list goes on and on. Climate alarmism, then somehow you should be banned, you should be canceled, you should be somehow made to pay a price, and you should be less equal than other citizens. Am I misreading this?
I think this is where we're at. We have the online harms bill coming up, and we've got lots of indications based on the kind of statements being made by government ministers that that there's very little toleration of anyone who would dare disagree with whatever the latest effort might be. I mean, like even like I just read earlier today, the questions about the environment minister about what happened in Jasper. And on the one hand, he says, well, I don't know very much about fighting fires or fire management. But then later on, he says, well, I'm absolutely sure that the reason why the fire in Jasper happened is all to do with climate change and not to do with the care of too many dead pine trees and on the forest floor. So there's just these quick solutions, which then are offered up, to a shrine somewhere that we must all bow down to and not question anything. And again, if we believe in democracy, we have to understand that freedom of speech and open debate needs to take place. I mean, people will only go to Ottawa, as the truck drivers did in the winter of February 2022, because all other efforts to have conversations and to raise questions with MPs and others fell on deaf ears.
I think you're absolutely right. You make a great point. So, Ray, as we look to wrapping up our quite far-reaching discussion today, do you have any advice on what citizens can do to make a difference? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of hope in this country as people kind of renew or become more and more aware of these concerns that we cannot take our freedom and rights for granted. Do you have any advice on what citizens can do?
Well, I think that the task is to keep the conversation going, or to begin conversations about where we are now at this point after the pandemic. And I want to mention too, I just saw that over in the province of Nova Scotia, they're advising everybody in the healthcare sectors and hospitals start putting on masks at every opportunity, except when they're in the lunchroom. So what's been going on the last 4 years? A lot of what has gone on is not ending, and we need to have conversations. I think a lot of people have had very fractious relationships, with friends and family that are in frayed places, and many people think the solution is to just put it all behind us and ignore it. And I think that that's naive. I think we need to find some way to have conversations, and to also to revisit the assumptions. Say, what do maybe people need to talk about how frightened they were about the protesters and the way they were being depicted, and how, how they thought it was really important to invoke the Emergencies Act, and then say, well, are you aware that, the protesters had agreed to start moving their trucks out of the city, or what, like just to begin to have a conversation. And of course there are many people who are not willing to have conversations, but I think that there are many people who are, and some that won't even be aware that there's a conversation to be had, that would be surprised if they knew some of what they can find out in places like my book.
Well, I think that's very good advice. So speak up, to respectfully, in good Canadian tradition and fashion, speak with our family, our friends, our neighbors about these issues. Do not be afraid, and certainly continue to seek the truth. So, Ray McGinnis, I want to thank you for joining our conversation with our audience today from all over. I noticed that we've got Nancy Cartwright listening from Ontario, to others from Alberta, right across the country. So I really appreciate all their questions and comments as well. But Ray, thank you for your courage and your work, including as author of the recent book Unjustified. So be sure to look at that. So thank you for joining us, Ray.
Thank you very much, David. Good to be with you.
So that brings to a close our conversation today. Please join us next Thursday, the same time and same place. It's been so good to talk with Ray McGinnis about these issues. They're pretty complex, and this one is no exception. But we do know that the rule of law is important, as we as Canadians have a long tradition of working together to have healthy discussion and debate as we seek the truth, and be able to not only ensure that justice is served, but that we live in a free and democratic society. And I'm sure you all agree we can't take that for granted. So thanks so much for joining us, and please share it, this conversation, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.